Cognitive language and learning disabilities. One of the areas we have consistently had the most difficulty in addressing has been the area of cognitive language and learning disabilities. Since the technologies that will emerge over the next 20 years have the potential for us to finally address barriers for this group in ways not possible before, a panel specifically focused on this group was included as part of day 2. Speaker bios are at futureofinterface.org/bios.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Clayton Lewis from the University of Colorado. Welcome to our panel on cognitive language and learning differences. Our aim here is to discuss the potential of the emerging technologies we've been hearing about during the event, as well as others that our panelists may wish to bring to the table. What's the potential of these technologies to provide better support for people with these differences? What barriers may these technologies bring with them, and how can these be overcome? As you know, the biographies of the panelists are on the website for you, so I'm going to introduce them very briefly. We have Kathy Bodine, who's the director of the Coleman Institute for Cognitive Disabilities at the University of Colorado. Rain Michaels, who's the staff user experience design manager at Google. Yuta Treviranus, who directs the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University in Toronto, and Rua Williams, assistant professor of computer graphics and technology at Purdue University. Kathy, can you start us off with your thoughts on the questions before the panel?
I can, and thank you so much. You know, I've been kind of laughing to myself for the last day and a half because this workshop so reminds me of my first day of work. You know, I showed up with my big hair and my shoulder pads and my diploma, and then I met my first 5 clients. None of them were verbal. 3 of them couldn't move very well. And I realized how much I had to learn. And I really feel that same way today. When we talk about the interfaces for people living with cognitive language and learning disabilities, we really are at the frontier of research and development in this space. And I think the potential is unbelievable. And I think that there are a lot of barriers. And today has been interesting as we've started to dive into some of these challenges and opportunities. And I really appreciate everyone who has spoken so far. So when I think about a research agenda and where we might be 20 years from now and the opportunities, I think about interfaces that are designed to be intuitive, that are seamless, and that they continuously adapt to the individual human context. And I think we've started kind of playing with that a bit earlier today as well. One of the things that I think we really can work on, and one of the barriers today, is understanding that true neuroscience of cognitive language and learning disabilities in a real world context. And the only way we can do that, in my opinion, is to truly understand the lived experience of those who live with cognitive disabilities, including how they think. And that to me means embracing the inclusion of people with cognitive disabilities within our work. I don't think we do that often enough, and sometimes not well enough. And I think that that is a barrier to success in what we're trying to accomplish. And I loved when Larry mentioned just a little bit ago that any interfaces out there need to enhance the human-to-human connection, because that connection really is what makes us human. And Sukli Liu, thank you so much for talking about just basic barriers that we create with our interfaces, something as simple as putting the equipment on, and how we think about what we're creating matters, and how it can be used in everyday context matters. And so I think those things are critically important. I also think, and I'm really excited about a project I'm working on with Microsoft now, and it's I have permission to talk about. It's a cognitive toolkit, and it's really how do we help our engineers and developers and researchers shift into thinking about designing for cognition, and how do we incorporate those pieces and parts in it. And I think we have to look at this next generation of practitioners, whether we're in medicine or engineering or science. We have to really make sure that teaching user experience testing, teaching how to do usability correctly, incorporating people with cognitive disabilities as team members in this process is really important, because we're not going to reduce these barriers to these interfaces if we don't incorporate all of these pieces and parts as we move forward. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out as something to think about. And it was interesting to me as we worked through this with all these engineers at Microsoft and thinking about how they learn and how they're going to incorporate these things. We realized we couldn't just dump it all at once. You know, you have to start small and build. And I think that that's something this group clearly brilliance everywhere. But how do we then put that out in the real world so that others can take from us what we know and what we've learned, and how can we incorporate that? So anyway, the thing that I think is so important is convergent research. And I love that National Science Foundation in particular is addressing this. And the reason for that is I started the first half of my career in medicine, and then I flipped to engineering for the second half of my career. And it stuns me that I can go to different meetings with these two groups and see how incredibly brilliant these folks are, but they're not always talking. And if we can bring together groups like we have here and continue that process in a convergent fashion, incorporating also our people with cognitive disabilities, we can immediately reduce a lot of the barriers, and we can enhance our learning and our work so much more quickly. So, and when we think about this, we need to think about how we do it. So we need to think about a range of methodologies that maybe aren't always in our comfort zones in how we were trained and how we think. Things, for example, such as ethnography, and really immersing ourselves in the environments and the context of the people that we're working with, will lead to better barrier identification and opportunities to create interfaces that are much stronger and much more worthwhile for the folks who we really want to have access to them. You know, we come with our own biases and assumptions about cognitive impairment and learning disabilities and how people think. And so example that I think about is measuring engagement. That's really challenging. We're doing some work with social assistive robotics. And so we wanted to measure the engagement of children with disabilities with our robot. And then we found there wasn't really a good way to measure that. And all the classification systems that were out there didn't work, because the affect of our kids is very different from the affects of more typical kids. And so we had to create our own classification library. So taking these things into account and really beginning to develop processes and repositories and how we can pull this together is very important. Ethical AI, this has been mentioned a little bit earlier today. How do we explore that for people with cognitive learning and language disorders? And how do we, more importantly, how do we incorporate or implement AI and machine learning in ways that work? I think those are things that we need to investigate fully. I also want to recognize that the feedback loop can and often is very different for people with cognitive disabilities than for those without cognitive disabilities. And that's okay, but we need to really truly understand that and think about what we can do and how we can better understand context or that lived experience. I want to come back to that. Language learning can often be very different for someone with a cognitive disability. And I'll give a great example, and Pillar mentioned iconography. We did a study many years ago where we looked at the symbols that were used on AAC devices and with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so one of the icons was an ambulance. And we all thought that's the perfect icon for help, for getting help, right? It even had the medical caduceus on it. It was a very clever icon. But guess what? For these adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that icon made them think of a van that took them to Pizza Hut to get pizza. They didn't view that as help. And so that's what I mean by understanding context and understanding how people learn language and how they use language as well as how they think. So I think those are very important, and there's a need for comprehensible information and usable communication technologies. We talk about speech input, and that's been talked about a lot. For someone with dysarthric speech or different types of speech, or maybe a different language pattern than someone without a disability, that's really challenging. And it makes these devices and these interfaces not work well. So we really want to think about how we can approach that and how we can use that. And then we need to think about this content fidelity across systems or platforms. It's frustrating when you move from one system to another and they don't operate the same and your interface doesn't work. We really need to work on that over the next 20 years. We need to think about people with cognitive disabilities as co-creators. We really need to incorporate their thinking into what we're designing for them. That's important to do. So research to me needs to focus on creating interfaces that are usable and intuitive for the user. Again, context matters, that can be personalized and compatible across platforms. So there brings in our standards, of course. And again, going back to the first thing I said, it has to be adaptable across context as we go throughout the day. So I'm going to stop there, Clayton, and let you take over.
Thank you, Kathy. Rain, can we hear from you next?
Yes, sure. Hi. So I come to accessibility with multiple personal contexts before being a designer that inform my perspective. And so first is, of course, my work as an interaction designer. And I specifically work in cognitive and learning disabilities and differences. And right now I'm highly focused on the reading space and reading comprehension. And I work with people with a lot of kind of intersectional differences in functional needs. But also I am autistic. And I grew up as the daughter of a woman who is blind, but can see color, not form so much, but color only from one eye. I'm also the mother of 2 children who are low support needs, but have intersectional disabilities themselves between the physical and cognitive space. And all of these perspectives inform my own work and really guide me. So with all of that in mind, for me, the most important consideration for the future of technology is that technology is designed for what people can and prefer to do, not for a diagnosis. The diagnosis tells you nothing. The fact that I'm autistic tells you absolutely nothing. However, in terms of functional needs, I need, for example, for audio, when I listen to audiobooks, I need that audio to be running at minimum 1.5x, probably 2x. Otherwise, I will not pay attention to it. That is a functional need, for example, and that's how I prefer to engage. And so this is really important because the diagnosis itself is so variable and so many, I love, Kathy, you spoke to contexts, and contexts are so important as well, because the intersectional needs of the individual, their lived experience, their context, they're all going to change how people prefer to interact. So going back to something very concrete with my mother, she actually, even though she's blind and she can't actually tell what an interface has on it, she can see its colors. And that is her choice of how she wants to engage. So for me, for my mother, for my children, for those people that I work with who have higher support needs, none of us are broken. We all have our unique perspectives. We have our strengths. And when we think about this in the context of creating technology, this could come in, for example, an individual with word decoding challenges. In the comment chain, Vince Cerf just commented about dyslexia, and maybe reading tools for people with low vision could, or blindness could be supportive for people with dyslexia. As you know, some individuals with dyslexia will still actually prefer to read visually. So how can we use the future technology that we're building to ensure that an individual can still engage through the modality that they prefer, or maybe they have strong visualization skills, and we can use something around AR and VR to bring people in more effectively. Last year, I was involved in a hackathon where a group of students invented this, or came up with this really clever idea to use Minecraft as a way for individuals with dyslexia to navigate their file system. And that was just so wonderful because it was so tangible and it was very visual and spatial. And we think about how educators for exceptional students with differing abilities or thought processes, actually kind of work with those students. They will actually always start when they create an individualized education plan with the students' sort of skills and what they enjoy and what they value before starting to think about how to create supports or scaffolding for that individual. And I think when we're working on technology, we want to sort of shift and do the same thing ourselves. Jerry mentioned yesterday during the Visions of the Future panel that we should be thinking about multiple ways to input intent into an interface, and beyond that, also multiple modalities to receive those outputs, really creating that flexibility, which isn't necessarily fancy AI personalization. It's just really thinking creatively as we move into the future about all of the modalities that are available. And now there are emerging technologies that can make it easier for us to provide multiple modalities or to enable somebody to very seamlessly move from one to the other. So how can we really think about that? And how can we move away from thinking about any kind of user as a normal user? Because really at the end of the day, there is no such thing. Everybody is very different. Contexts will change every human being. And when it comes to cognition especially, we'll all have moments where different things are competing for our cognitive abilities, and we will encounter barriers with interfaces that might change who we are. I don't want to take up too much time. So skipping ahead to the things that I was thinking of talking to, when we specifically thinking about like reading and symbol comprehension, for example, some individuals will prefer to hear the text. Some will want to see and listen together, and that's how they'll comprehend more effectively. Some will prefer silence or need silence, and but will kind of need visual transformations that might help them with comprehension. Some might want easy read, and some might actually really want to make sure that they can still access the source material. Maybe contextually they're in a classroom environment and they're actually trying to learn the content and make their own critical decisions on what the content means. If we offer those individuals sort of automated easy read translations or summarizations, for example, we might be robbing those individuals of the chance to actually make their own constructive decisions. And this actually points to something else that was happening in the chat that Andreas brought up about, trying to take some of these opportunities away from the individual or speaking for the individual, which we definitely don't want to do. And Rua, I believe you're planning to speak to this a little bit as well. So that's also, I think, quite important. And then one more thing that I'd really like to add is that we also need to be thinking about equity in the future of technology, which depends heavily on moving features into the mainstream, because so many individuals with cognitive and learning disabilities and differences never even receive a diagnosis, especially if they're individuals from underfunded areas, if they are individuals of color, if they're individuals who are vulnerable to a lot of systemic biases. These individuals may never receive appropriate diagnoses, and in the systems that we have today, that also means that they will never be given the right to use some of the assistive technologies that we create, such as text-to-speech in a classroom. You have to have a diagnosis in order to be able to use that. The British Dyslexia Association found in a study in 2019 that 80% of the students in the UK with dyslexia graduated without a diagnosis. So that's 80% of the individuals who needed support never got them. And this is something that we need to be thinking about in the future of interfaces. And what it means is that when we're thinking about the technology that we're innovating, how can we actually move these supports into the mainstream rather than restricting them just to very specific and bespoke tools that people with diagnoses can access? Thank you.
Thank you, Rain.
Back to you, Clayton.
Yuta, can we hear from you now?
Sure. And Kathy and Rain have covered some of the specific points I wanted to make so beautifully. So I'm sort of scrambling to erase them so I don't repeat them. I've worked in this field of alternative interfaces for 40 years. My team, our community, and I have at one point or another worked in all of the topics we've covered in these 2 days. And what we found is cognitive language and learning barriers are a challenge for everyone and in every one of these topics. We've been exploring things like personalized interfaces for more than 2 decades, and there's certainly a cognitive aspect to that. In the area specific to cognitive language and learning, we've worked on the democratization of design and development of interfaces to increase the agency of individuals and communities to adapt their own interfaces, including recently using systems like Codex and GitHub Copilot to personally create and adapt your own interface using natural language commands. For learning, we've been creating systems that support you to be a data scientist in your own learning so that you have ownership of that knowledge of how you learn best. And we've co-designed systems that enable people to determine the trustworthiness of AI systems, accessible learning management systems, open education communities that create accessible variants of learning resources, multimodal haptic maps, and what I mentioned yesterday, cooperative data trusts for bottom-up community-owned and controlled data systems. The realm of cognitive language and learning is messy and it's complex. There's no definitive fix or solution. It is not amenable to the traditional engineering approaches. And I argue that it requires a wabi-sabi mindset, understanding the value of the imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. There's no full accessibility. There's no definitive checklist. There are no clear categories or boundaries. I think this is good, actually. And it may be the impetus for better directions in this field in general. In any discussions of the future of this collective human endeavor, I want to ask both, where do we seem to be going and where should we be going? And I know we're not supposed to, but I'm going to be a little transgressive, Clayton. This leads me to the question of catching up or even anticipating where innovation is heading, and to ask which way should or who should be adapting. To me, the general innovation imperative that is driving our direction has lost its way. I think we need a much more fundamental and deeper innovation. And here I don't mean the shiny new objects that can do new tricks, a fad that can be monetized to make ridiculous profit. I mean a deep and lasting change that is more than a toy for the elite that can afford it, more than a convenience, more than a new addiction or pastime to compete for our attention. Attending to this challenge, which this community is doing, should lead innovation. I've been alarmed by the harm done by artificial intelligence, the acceleration, amplification, and automation of past discrimination, the opportunities for abuse and misuse, especially with the population we're talking about right now. But there is a positive view of how it can potentially change our perspective. It certainly made manifest the harms of our human framing and brought them into the purview of hard scientists who previously would dismiss many of our concerns. I'm thinking that it might also devalue a certain kind of intelligence that we have been valorizing, a mechanistic intelligence, so we can turn our attention to a richer set of human intelligences or ways of knowing and potentially even developing wisdom, which I know we're not supposed to discuss either. Before we can truly innovate, we have some unlearning to do. We need to unlearn the notion of an average human and the application of statistical reasoning that accompanies it with respect to assuming that truth, proof, or evidence about humans is found at the statistical mean. We need to abandon the notion that the fuel of evolutionary advance is survival of the fittest, zero-sum competition, when it is actually the diversification of evolutionary choices afforded by relaxed selection. So drop those notions of best practice. We need to stop trying to box people into reductionist classifications and see them as multifaceted, high-dimensional, complexly connected beings. We need to abandon the quick wins of the 80% that take 20% of the effort and focus on the 20% that occupy the 80% of the unexplored human terrain. In our education, I think we need to stop creating standardized learners. In our employment, we need to stop looking for replaceable workers. We need to learn to differentiate and support communities that weave together our complementary skills. And I think this field or this area can lead in that. Borrowing from complexity theory, because I think there's probably some complexity theorists within this audience, I want to share a brain worm that I can't dismiss, a version of an earworm or a tune I can't get rid of. I think we're hill climbing a local optima rather than finding the global optima. For those who are not familiar with the theory of hill climbing, think of our collective human journey into the unknown future as navigating a complex, unpredictable, changing terrain of mountains and valleys that is shrouded by fog. We need to find the highest point in this terrain to survive and thrive. Think of it as escaping from a rising water level. To survive as a species, we need to find a generous high place that has room for us all. Unfortunately, we're stuck on a small, steep, spiky mountain. In our attempt to get to the top of this small mountain, we're eroding the slope, making it harder for many people to climb out of danger and destroying everything we need to survive in the long term. And basically what we need to do to change that, to find the global optima, is to work with, listen to, and support the individuals that we've currently left at the bottom of this steep hill. They are the ones that have a better long-term view, a broader view, because they are more diverse. And unfortunately, what we've done even in this field is that we have devalued those particular perspectives. So what is the research and development agenda? Let's create a research agenda that understands, supports our human diversity, doesn't reduce it, and that makes it possible to orchestrate our diverse complementary human contributions rather than powering towards a monoculture. Rather than catching up, I think what we need to do in this area is offer alternative directions.
You've paused. So thank you. I was going to say that for that absolutely fabulous metaphor, you would get an extra minute, but since you stopped, we'll
well, I have more to say about that, but I'll leave it for the next.
Thank you so much for that, Yuta. Rua, over to you.
Hello, I'm Rua Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University in user experience design, and I'm a social science research council Just Tech fellow. And I think I'm required to say that everywhere that I go because they own me now. And I just wanted to say that I have had the opportunity to meet Yuta, but I have not actually had the chance to hear Yuta. So that was really nice. Thank you. So I wanted to begin with a bold claim and then continue from there. So all inaccessible technology is a symptom of an inaccessible society. So there's no such thing as a technology that is inherently inaccessible. All technology is designed and is a product of human work. And those things get made in a way that exclude other people because the designers belong to a society that does not think of them as people. My friend and I am a self-advocate for people with cognitive disabilities and formerly institutionalized person, Cal Montgomery, has a saying, and he says, as long as you're accessible, I'm going to be okay. And what Cal is saying is that, like, we recognize that there's no such thing as a universally accessible solution. There's no such thing as the checklist that means, okay, you followed all the steps and now this design is perfect. And that's not a requirement for innovation or progress or creation. We know that sometimes we're going to invite each other to dinner and then find that the step at the front door is too high. But as long as the people that you're going to dinner with are accessible, then there will be a solution, whether it's that they carry you over the step or they find a plank or they go somewhere else, right? And so we have a number of barriers in interface design for cognitive disability and disability in general. And they start on social attitudes. Like, we have preconceptions about what kinds of use count or that we are designing for, and about who is the user. And when we talk about design of technology for people with cognitive disabilities, we often assume that they're actually a sub-user in a system in which their caregiver is the super user. Many systems are designed this way, or designed to solve the issues of cognitive access in this way. At the same time, we have kind of a fixation on the idea of accessible technology and affording independence without understanding the nuances of interdependence as a sort of a societal, like, cultural structure. And so we have this like sort of bivalent, we tend to assume that a person with a cognitive disability has somebody who's taking care of them, while also we assume that everybody's goal is to be independent. But also we don't always pay attention to the ways that some of these caregiving relationships can be coercive and not healthy. That this is a complicated space of relationality to be navigating, and it actually is relevant in design when you think about who has access to whose data and who has control over whose technological decisions. Additionally, something that I feel like technology does a great job of highlighting for us are places where we have inaccessibility in social systems. In particular, I'm thinking of public services. So I think it was Rain that had mentioned the issue of there are many people with cognitive disabilities who will never get a diagnosis and will never get the right to assistive technology for that. And one of the places where I see this a lot is in people who have experienced poverty or homelessness. Many of the people that I work with that have endured these things are disabled, and some of them know on some level that they are, but many don't identify as such. Many actually remember being in some form of special education or segregated education, but they don't have any awareness of themselves as being disabled and therefore entitled to certain accommodations. At the same time, I have friends who do know that they're disabled and that disability is cognitive, and yet when they're involved in the court systems, there is nothing to support them through those hearings, because we pretty much only care about sight and hearing and ramps. We think that if we cover the entrance to the door, that's good enough. The idea that somebody might need support in communication on a cognitive level is often regarded with like suspicion that you're somehow trying to cheat the system. And that's not just in education, it's especially prevalent in public service, and it's really pernicious. But like I said, it's the technologies often highlight these gaps. So for example, as public services move into online systems, algorithmic systems, but also just being able to apply for certain services online, the inherent hostility of bureaucratic forms become more evident through the technologies in which they become even more exclusive. And so I think that centering cognitive disability supports in these kinds of structures is a tremendous opportunity, not just in reforming public services, but also in understanding an interconnected, multilingual world that is currently navigating a global pandemic that has impacts on the cognitive capacities of all people. And so I'm curious as to why I haven't seen so much in the space of interface design that's related to principles of easy read and plain language. And going back to what Rain was saying about how not everybody actually wants those things or wants only access to those things. What I mean is that we have thought intensely about how to present textual information in a way that will support the understanding of people with cognitive disabilities. but we haven't extended that to the visual and spatial realm of interfaces, not in any kind of way that actually is placed in a broader like technological landscape. Often if they feel like the app is just for people with cognitive disabilities, then that might come into play, but otherwise it does not. And so I feel like some of the things that we regard as like flexibility in interfaces that are like we find them to be default now are actually very new. So for example, resizing a window is pretty old, but also the thing where you can automatically divide your screen into regions with different windows on it, that's fairly new. And that's a cognitive support. The new, like you can set your phone default to dark mode, and then any app that supports dark mode is in dark mode. That's very new, but also a tremendous benefit to people with like visually related, like migraine conditions and such. And so the idea that we actually have already begun this work and can actually foreground and drive towards this idea about a system level flexibility in light, dark mode, a multimodal interactions where everything has a corresponding visual and oral element. The idea that we have already a system level text size, like a font size that you can set, we can do the line highlighting or the fading that Rain was talking about that they do for people with dyslexia, that like Beeline Reader is a popular example of one that does this. Like we can do system level flexible supports that change interfaces that make them more accessible. We just often are not thinking about them. Like these things seem somehow need to reach a critical mass, like dark mode became so popular for the nerds that now everybody can have dark mode all the time. And so I want us to think more on this like cultural level of design and how attending to accessibility, but also in particular, a respect for and an attention to cognitive disability can sort of transform our approach to basic best practices or even just common practices in design.
So Rua, can I ask you to at least pause there, because I want to give the baton back to you with a question.
Mm-hmm.
Relates to one of the points you raised, but I think also leads out into some other discussion. So I think we can all agree, and you pointed to this, that, you know, I forget your exact wonderful wording about the terrible bureaucratic language of forms. So I think we can all agree that classical automation has just lots and lots of challenges, really for everybody, but especially for people we're focusing on here. Could you comment on the prospect, if any, that the technologies represented by large language models offer us any relief in that space? Can we envision any better kind of automation based on those technologies, or is that a delusion?
I think that it's largely a delusion at this time, because large language models are dependent upon large databases, which are built off of the artifacts of a biased culture. So we don't have the ability to pull in data from a culture that respects disabled people because we don't have it. And so a large language model can't always be thought of as a key to supporting people, because that language model is built off of a society that oftentimes literally hates the user that we think it might help. So I don't, especially not when it comes to the bureaucratic form realm. One of the major, I think, points on that bureaucratic form realm and other things really relates to the ethical design theories of dark patterns. And these are like design patterns that we do on purpose to trick or mislead the user. We not only do this on social media and in ads, we do this in public policy. And we do this on purpose. Okay. And so a commitment to bright patterns would be necessary, but that's a cultural transformation because public policy is literally is committed to the project of eugenics, quite frankly. So that has to change.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment on those matters? Go ahead. Sorry, Rain.
Yeah, I think that there are, I really appreciate what you said about how the large language models themselves are trained on biased data. And it is quite poignant to say even data that hates, that was built by people who hate people who are different, people with disabilities included. And that is definitely something that we need to be thinking very carefully about. But I also think that in the future, not as Rua said, not now, we have a long way to go. But in the future, if we start thinking about these technologies like large language models, not as sweeping things that are going to change everything, but rather think about the smaller practical uses of such models. We have now, like DALL-E has image generation based on language. So is it possible, for example, that that people could choose to process information in a different way by using the tools strategically on a much smaller, more practical scale? And I think that's something that we might want to be looking at for the future. With the caveat, as everyone here, Kathy, Yuta, Rua, as you also eloquently expressed, that if that happens, it needs the creation of those tools needs to include people with the various disabilities and differences that we're considering, so that it is equitable, so that it isn't biased, or so that at least we understand what those biases might be. But I do think that there may be a future where we can be strategic and careful.
Thank you. Yuta or Kathy, do you want to?
Yeah, can I'm going to take a middle road because I think that there may be some potential. And I completely agree with Rua that the data sets that are currently used to train the models are hugely biased and they contain all sorts of harmful content. So my question has been, can we do several things? First of all, we've been exploring exploration algorithms as opposed to exploitation algorithms. So rather than using the model of the optima and trying to match that model, attempting to diversify the selections that are being made or the filter. We've also been looking at, can we create a bottom-up version? I mean, Euphonia and other projects like that are starting with the very specific and local and building upon those. What that, of course, brings is, how do we unlearn the negative aspects or the harmful aspects of the large language models to borrow some of the learning that isn't biased or that isn't discriminatory? Is there potentially a way to do that? The one other negative point that I want to bring up is frequently applications for people with disabilities are used to whitewash the implementation of AI. I've frequently heard, well, look at these miraculous voice recognition or image recognition systems. Do you want to get rid of all AI because you'll be getting rid of these miraculously empowering things that are there for people with disabilities? But even there, I think even in our field and in the creation of wonderful things, they are biased against the smaller minorities, so that the individuals that need these tools the most are the ones that for whom they work the worst. So if you are in a unusual environment that the system wasn't trained on, then the image recognition system isn't going to recognize the objects in your environment. The further your voice is from the norm, the voice recognition won't work. Even so, I think we need to fundamentally figure out how we're going to find an alternative to the statistical reasoning, find an alternative to what our notions of optima, look at the spectrum, look at exploration. And the fact that the LLMs and the generative models are allowing us to at least move slightly away from that optimization and statistical reasoning, I think might hold some chinks in there that we can drive a wedge into. But I'd love to discuss that further.
Kathy, any comment from you or any point you'd like to bring in?
I love my colleagues. They're so eloquent and they've really summarized everything that I might say. I think that we sometimes mistake compassion and empathy for help. And I think that that's really what we're saying. And I think that some hard science in this area would be delightful and critically necessary so that we can reframe what we think is our current understanding. So that's what I would add.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's this notion of the dignity of risk as well, which I think several of us have. The paternalistic, yesterday when we were talking about Big Mother, I was cringing a little bit because that again, it doesn't allow for the dignity and respect and agency and personal choice quite often. Or maybe I have a different Big Mother image than other people have.
So shifting gears a bit from LLMs and associated ideas to sort of software as we have it today, is there progress to be made there? Can any of you envision that software architecture can be enhanced so as to support more readily the kinds of flexibilities that I think everybody at this event is looking for? Anybody want to comment on that one? No? Yuta, I was sure you would, because I associate your group specifically with efforts in that area.
Actually, can you repeat that? I was trying to answer a question in Discord. I shouldn't do that.
At software from a more conventional point of view, one of its characteristics now is that it's really hard to support multiple interfaces, even when you know what they all are. But if you move to the real situation, which is that new modes of interaction are constantly emerging, we're caught completely flat-footed by that as technologists. Do you see any hope in that space that we can shape cognitive architecture to make it more flexible in a fundamental way?
Yeah, and that I referred earlier to this project that we're doing where we're looking at Codex and the GitHub as for individuals to actually control their own interfaces, or to do user continued design, user modification. So radical democratization, I guess you would say. Can we use natural language statements to say, okay, this isn't working for me, can you code me something else? So not only having direct control over what your interface might look like by virtue of having some more natural language access to the code. There's been a number of, I think the idea of full accessibility and the one size fits one checklist that we seem to be promoting within the accessibility field is somewhat problematic and has kept us from really exploring what's possible within interfaces and within the way that we're presenting information and curriculum, etc. I think we need to create a version of interface design that acknowledges that we're all very diverse, and people with disabilities are more diverse than people who don't have disabilities. And so I'm very, very cautiously optimistic, but I think I've often been too much of an optimist, that there may be some ways in which we can use the emerging models in this way. But I'd love to hear from the other panelists.
Yeah, anyone else on the panel have a brief comment on that one before we move to audience questions?
Yes, I just wanted to say that as far as like, I don't remember anymore, but Judah was saying something that reminded me of one of the problems that what my blind friends talk about a lot, which is that they report an error in a system and they're told that it's user error, right? So this idea that how do we fix interface access? Well, we have to come back to a culture of actually like recognizing that anytime a user is struggling, we've done something wrong. You know, or that there's some kind of structure of support that we can provide. If they can't find their way around, then we have to do something about it. But oftentimes we have seen a precedent from blind communities that the people who have made the thing believe that it works because it meets some standards of like WCAG or something, and that therefore the problem can't be theirs. It has to be that there was an update to JAWS that they're not responsible for, or that you just can't, that you're using your computer wrong. And like that culture of like dismissal has to stop. And there has to be more of like a radical desire for like fixing bugs. Like assuming that anytime a user is lost, that is a bug, no matter what. I don't know.
Rain, is your hand up or still up? Or
my hand is up. I'd like to just quickly say that another really important way that we can, as creators of technology, really think about supporting people is to let go of this idea that we have the best solution, and to make sure that the technology that we create can always be overridden by the user. So if, for example, we have text-to-speech that we've created and love, well, the user can override that and use text-to-speech that they prefer. That's a very simple example, but to really not have sort of the hubris to think that as the creators, we know best, and to let people adjust their settings and their environment with their own technology as they might need to.
Thanks. So shifting now to questions that come in the chat, and apologies in advance, as usual, we won't be able to get to all of them. So I'm just going to pick some here. So I have a question from Andreas Forsfund. If aphasia is known to any of you, do you see XR being useful? Machine vision, tagging, object recognition, etc. Anyone want to offer a brief thought on that? Rain, you're nodding. Do you want to say something?
Sure, yes. So one of the things that happens with aphasia is that you yourself may know exactly the word that you're trying to say, or you may recognize the word and your brain may be translating it correctly. But for some reason, there's kind of that communication gap where externally it appears that that comprehension is not happening. And for some individuals with aphasia, the combination of the image or the real world thing, that tangible thing, plus the word or the sound or some other modality combined together can be just enough to make it possible for that actual kind of communication exchange to be successful. So I do see that there could be a lot of value in some kind of augmented reality or some of these new ways of interacting with the world in both a digital and physical way could actually provide some individuals with a way to more confidently and successfully communicate what's in their minds externally to other individuals.
Thanks. Sorry, Kathy, your hand is up. Did you want to comment there?
I do, and thank you so much. I agree with Rain that it can be very helpful. I've actually had 6 clients with aphasia who learned to speak again years after a stroke with that combination presented in other forms. But I also want to make the point, and we haven't really talked about this when it comes to interfaces writ large, and that is the mindfulness we need to be thinking about in terms of cognitive load. So we invent all these crazy cool things, but we don't recognize that we've inserted something new and different, or something that adds to the cognitive burden of actually being able to do the task we want to do. And so I think that's one of the biggest barriers I see in a lot of the interfaces that are available today, is that we add to the cognitive load, we're not decreasing it. And so I think we have to be mindful of how these tools are implemented and what the requirements are to actually be able to use them in order to have this fantastical access to incomprehensible websites or whatever it is that we're trying to do. So I think that that's really important to consider. So
I'm going to try to weave together a couple of comments, questions in the chat, and hope I don't do violence to them. So one participant is asking whether the ideal of adapting any interface to meet all your needs is attainable. And another participant is noting that many people with disabilities are very good at working through challenges, grasping new tools, and the like. Does that inspire any reaction from any of you?
Yes. This is Ruan. So firstly, I wanted to piggyback on the comments about cognitive load. And so this is the thing that we don't take into account often when we talk about tech adoption. But the additional cognitive load that some kind of technical innovation makes is a factor in failure to adopt. At the same time, this comment about like, is it possible to ever make the fully flexible, customizable interface? No, but it's always a good aspiration. If you're thinking about different ways to provide and afford the most flexibility and the most customization, then you're getting somewhere that you haven't been before, and that's good. The last thread that I already forgot what it was. The last thing that you said, Clayton, what was that?
Never mind. It can't have been memorable. So Yuta, I've seen your hand.
Yeah, I want to add a quick story to the cognitive load thing. That relates to the accessibility and this notion of an accessible interface. I was toured at a school where they were saying, isn't this amazing? We've made our high stakes test completely accessible. And they showed me this young man who was using a single switch to scan the test. And it took 60 hits to enter each word. And this was declared to be fully accessible without any determination of with respect to cognitive load. I think the agency of the individual is something that we also frequently, many of us have, or there's within this field, there are many people that view themselves as experts, but I think really the only expertise, real expertise, long-standing expertise, whether it's within education, within employment, within rehab, needs to be the individual. So it's not only the agency and control over the interface, but also the data about what works for them and what doesn't. So how do we inform people and help them to become these experimental scientists in what it is that works for them and what it is that doesn't work for them, especially for individuals where that is constantly shifting. So self-recalibration of an interface. And I don't think there's any answer with respect to whether it is one interface or multiple interface, and that's up to the individual and how they learn best, how they change context best, etc. And we probably need to give the individuals the control over moving from context to context and what the interface should look like in the various contexts.
So in the remaining minute, I'd like to throw us all the way back to the very first session, in which one of the things Jerry Ellsworth said was that one of the best things we can do is get rid of stuff. That is, that we should be focusing on the virtues of simplicity. Rather than asking you to endorse that idea, any of you have thoughts about how a research agenda could support the objective of creating a world of simpler interfaces? Any ideas about that?
This is Rain. I would like to challenge us here that simplicity doesn't necessarily mean simplicity. Simplicity is what comes out and what the individual experiences at the end, not necessarily what we create. And I actually think that all of us here are realistically advocating for some really hard work that is going to be quite complex. And so the research agenda is to find out what the individual at the end will experience as simple, but not to think about simplicity itself as the goal.